2010, he became an entrepreneur in residence at Harvard Business School. He has won a Tech Fellow Award from TechCrunch, and Business Week named him one of the best young entrepreneurs of tech. Please join me in welcoming Eric to Microsoft. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. This is really exciting for me. The last time I was on the Microsoft campus, I was an intern, probably 15 years ago. The building numbers did not go up to 99, or even close. I was like, 99, where are we? Oh, my God. Yeah, things were really different then. Bill Gates welcomed the interns personally at his house, got to shake the great man's hand. Just so things were a little different back then. I remember working on the IIS team back before NT5 shipped. So, just to give you some sense of what we were up to back then. And on the very ill-named Microsoft repository. A lot of cocktail party jokes for years about that. So it is really, it's a bit of an honor to be back, and so thank you for welcoming me back. I wanted to, right off the top, go over some important ground rules. The first one is that I do not want your undivided attention. So anyone who made the mistake of turning their phone off, if you take it back out and turn it on, no joke, please. If you're not connected to the internet, you've made some kind of horrible mistake. So please, let's undo that. And of course, laptops out. That's what I appreciate. And if you want to tweet, or I don't know what you guys do here, but whatever it is amongst yourselves, please feel free. Just all I ask is you use the Lean Startup hashtag if you're on Twitter, because I really like feedback, and the real-time feedback's even the best. So anything you want to say to me, you can do. So I have this new book coming out. It is now out. I've been saying coming out for so long. It's become a habit. It just came out on Tuesday. So it's really a thrill to finally get to share it and hear what people think. And my blog is Startup Lessons Learned, and you can find me on Twitter. And I thought I would just start with 5 lean startup principles from the book. Here they are. Entrepreneurs are everywhere. Entrepreneurship is management, validated learning, build, measure, learn, and innovation accounting. And I always have to apologize right at this point because some of you came to what you thought was going to be a really cool talk about entrepreneurship, and now we're going to talk about management and accounting, maybe the 2 most boring subjects known to man. So I apologize in advance, but that's what you're going to get. You feel free to leave. It's okay. And because Microsoft is a relatively large company, you might have noticed, it's important to start with this one right away, which is that we have in mind, most of us, this very specific image of what it means to be an entrepreneur. Pretty much involves living in a garage, eating ramen noodles, maybe inventing some radical, cool new thing that everybody doesn't understand, and then kind of like flash forward, all of a sudden it's on the cover of magazines. That's pretty much the story arc. Crazy idea, ... cover of magazines. And I think that's deeply misguided, so I wanted to start with a more rigorous definition of entrepreneurship, and so here's mine. A startup is a human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And I want to start with that because the most important part of this definition is what is not included. Namely, it doesn't say anything about how big your company is. It doesn't say anything about what industry you operate in or even what sector of the economy you work in. Entrepreneurship is fundamentally about institution building under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And by that I mean situations where we do not know who the customer is. We do not know what they want. We do not know what the product needs to be. We do not know what our distribution channel is going to be. We have at best hypotheses or guesses about those things. And that's all a very fancy way of saying that a startup is an experiment. But the cool thing about being an entrepreneur now in the 21st century compared to in the past is that we live in a time where we can build anything we can imagine, which is a new turn of events. In fact, our big problem today is not figuring out can something be built, it's figuring out should something be built. Can we build a sustainable business around a certain set of products and services? That question is one unique to our moment. In the past, most people were worried about how do we make more stuff more efficiently, but guess what? We have more stuff than we know what to do with. And the real question is how do we make more stuff, especially in the software industry. The last thing we need is more code, you guys know. Right? What we need to figure out is what actually makes customers' lives better, what is a path to some kind of sustainable success. And so when I say experiment, I don't just mean throwing stuff on the wall to see what sticks. I mean experiment in the scientific sense of having a specific hypothesis and testing it rigorously. And that's what the Lean Startup is. It is the application of the scientific method to the process of innovation. And that's the good news. The bad news is right now, as an industry, we are really bad at this. And I would go so far as to say that we are wasting people's time on an industrial scale. and it has to stop. So we all know that most startups fail, but I thought I'd just bring a demonstration. Not like any of this will seem any familiar to you guys, but for those of us who work in Silicon Valley, we've noticed this pattern. Anyone remember this diagram? Is this familiar to anybody? There was a time when Web 2.0 was really cool. This is from 2006, and antiquity, when everyone thought, at least in Silicon Valley, we were very excited about this new wave of innovation called Web 2.0 that was going to radically transform the entire online experience of customers around the world. And so a graphic designer was feeling really excited about that. They put together this patchwork quilt of all the logos of all the exciting Web 2.0 companies as an expression of just how much innovation there was going on. And so in 2009, just if you're keeping score, 3 years later, a different graphic designer was feeling a slightly different set of feelings when they put together this chart. This is the 3-year report card on Web 2.0. And the red X's, of course, are the companies that are already dead, which is I think is pretty remarkable. Remember, these are software companies. Not one of these companies is working on quantum teleportation. Okay, these are software companies. Every one of these products was able to be built successfully, and yet in 3 years, more than half are already dead. And I don't know if you can see this. My favorite part of this chart is that the designer marked with a green circle the so-called success stories of Web 2.0. The companies that, in their definition, either had gone public or were acquired by a bigger company. So since we're talking about Web 2.0, this just means were acquired by a bigger company. And those are the successes where at least somebody made some money, which I'm all fine with. But you guys may be familiar with this phenomenon that sometimes when a startup exits, it exits to its grave because it gets incorporated into a larger company and things don't actually go that well. And not that you guys have this problem, but you heard other big companies have this problem. They buy startups and things don't work out like it's supposed to in the plan. And I just think this is appalling. And the fact that we've taken this for granted, I think, is a hangover of the fact that entrepreneurship used to be about taking really radically bold technical risks. And so we're used to the idea that if you're doing something difficult, technical, obviously you're going to have a lot of failure. But I think, for a lot of these products, there's just no excuse for building products that people don't want. I mean, that's really that simple. When I say we're wasting people's time, that is the waste that we're talking about. And I should say, as a matter of disclosure, most of the startups that I've built have failed too. So I know as you're like a professional expert, you're not supposed to get up in front of people and be like, hi, most of my companies have failed, and if you follow me, you can fail too. But that's the truth. Anyone who's telling you the truth about entrepreneurship is going to tell you stories of failure, and anyone that talks to you about success to success to success is lying to your face. And that's true whether we're talking about managers inside existing companies or guys in a garage or a VC bag, doesn't matter. Entrepreneurship, because it deals with that high uncertainty situations, is fundamentally about failure as a prerequisite to success. But it has to be somebody's fault. You guys understand, right? And obviously it can't be my fault that my company's failed. It has to be somebody else's fault. I prefer somebody who's dead. So I blame this guy. This is Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of something called scientific management, which is actually is literally 100 years old this year. So we are the 100th anniversary of management this year. I celebrated, but most people didn't seem to notice. And that's because we remember Fred Taylor. If any of you had to study Fred Taylor in a class or some kind of history management class, we remember him for his most discredited ideas, like the idea that workers were basically robots who needed to be managed by their socially superiors, their social class superiors, and that we should make very rigid plans, and we should do something called time and motion study, which is about following people around with a stopwatch to figure out, how do we be like following a program around, be like, how do we reduce the number of keystrokes by watching how long it takes you to type. Those ideas are discredited, and so we remember him as kind of a comical figure. But I believe that's because the things that he really deserves credit for having invented, we can't imagine that they had to be invented. Like the idea that work should be done as efficiently as possible. I mean, that had to be invented. There was a time when people didn't know that. My favorite is what he called the task plus bonus system. This is a really wild one. The idea is that if you have a big project, you should have a manager, someone who's trained in doing this for a living. And that person could, using science, decompose the project into a series of tasks. Those tasks would be farmed out to individual functional specialists who did that kind of task over and over again. And this is the kicker. I love this part. If the person does the task better than expected, then they should be paid a bonus instead of penalized. And I mean, it's hard to even really think about this. And you read these works from 1911, and you go, well, who is he arguing against that we should do this? And he has to lay out the counter argument, like any good polemicist. Here's how people do it today. In the 19th century, if you had a machine shop or a factory, and a worker found a way to increase their what's called a piece rate, the number of pieces of the work that they could get done in a day, they would be penalized. Why? Because it reveals that they're obviously a person of low moral character. Why? Because yesterday, they weren't churning out as many pieces, and today, now they are. It shows that they could have been churning out more pieces this whole time. It gets better. What about their coworkers who are still doing it the old way? All those people are of low moral character because all of them could have been doing this the whole time. So not only would the person be penalized, but all their coworkers would be too. So collective retribution for efficiency improvements. Not that this sounds familiar to anybody. But in 1911, this was a radical idea that we shouldn't do that. And so Taylor's famous for having said, in the past, the man was first. In the future, the system will be first. And we are so used to thinking of work, factories, supply chains as systems that we're like, gosh, somebody had to invent that, but it had to be invented. And like I said before, if Fred Taylor was alive today, he would be very confused about the problems that we face because he never had to ask the question of what should be built. In 1911, people were starving and there wasn't enough stuff. And so what should be built? All productive capacity needed to be improved so that we could have more stuff. I mean, that really was the question of the 20th century. And the idea that we have more stuff than we know what to do with would have really baffled him. But this leads to death in startups. Because like all 20th century management tools, it has at its heart the idea that management should be based on planning and forecasting. And when I was doing the research for the book, one of the things that really blew my mind was that there was a time in the past when people made forecasts of things, and then those things happened, which I didn't know. That never happened to me in my career. I've never made a forecast of anything that came remotely true. I'd never even seen it done by somebody else. I thought forecasting was an exercise you did to please investors or bosses, almost like a ritual, just to prove that you were serious about it. You do this tedious exercise to kind of show your commitment. I didn't understand that that had some kind of purpose. And yet there was a time when we could forecast what was going to happen with enough accuracy that we could manage people by saying, if you beat the plan, if you beat the forecast, you get a bonus. And if not, not. And that still works great in situations where we have a long and stable operating history. Because that's what planning and forecasting is based on. If you have a stable operating history, it works great. And who feels like the world is getting more and more stable every day? Anybody? No, of course not. So what is happening on an industrial revolution basis is that work is being moved from the domain of general management, where we can use planning and forecasting as our main tools, into this other domain. And yet we're not changing the tools when that shift happens, and that, I think, is at the root of all this failure. So that's by way of saying that entrepreneurship is management, which I feel like to some people it's like saying day is night. And what could be more different, right? Entrepreneurship is cool and hip. It's this cool kids in the garage and the social network and all this cool stuff. And management is like, oh, God, right? Boring guys in suits doing God knows what. But I think that is a real misconception about what is the goal of management. Management is fundamentally about institution building. And so the fact that general management of the 20th century happens to be about really boring forecasts and plans and spreadsheets shouldn't deter us from trying to develop a new discipline of entrepreneurial management, a peer discipline to general management, not better, not worse, just different, geared specifically to the context of extreme uncertainty that is the domain of startups. And probably the most important tool in the toolkit of entrepreneurial management is this thing called the pivot, which has kind of become an overused buzzword you might have noticed. I apologize. I just saw this relatively recently in the New Yorker magazine. This is not a joke. I'm not leaving you. I'm pivoting to another man. So I was like, oh, God, what is happening? Like the word pivot has just gone crazy. But in Silicon Valley, I don't know if you guys do this too, but in Silicon Valley we have this phenomenon where we take a concept, like we ignore it, and then it goes all the way from being totally ignored to being overhyped and overused. We don't want to use it anymore without having passed through the intervening stage of actually learning to use it correctly. And so TechCrunch actually banned usage of the word pivot before they'd ever actually used it correctly. So it has been kind of a strange arc for the pivot. But it is a critically important concept because, as I said before, if you're going to have success as a startup, you have to have failure first. And the funny thing about startup failures is that when it's done well, and startups run into difficulty, they don't just give up and go home. But neither do they persevere the plane straight into the ground through stubbornness. They do this funny thing where they keep one foot anchored in what was working before and change one other thing at a time. And from the outside, it can be really confusing. So in the book, I tell a story of Groupon, how Groupon got started. One of my favorite pivot stories. They started out as this thing called The Point, which was it wasn't about group coupons, it was about group social activism. So it's like we could have a petition to go protest City Hall, and if 100 people all say we're going to do it, then we'll show up and have the protest. And if that doesn't sound like the world's best idea, it's not. They spent, I think, a year and $1 million building that product and got nowhere. And they decided, something's not right, it's time to pivot. And they thought, well, let's check out this idea of group coupons. And they built what we would now call a minimum viable product. It was just a blog. They took a WordPress blog and skinned it to say Groupon, hot new technology Groupon. And they offered their very first coupon. Anyone know what it was? 2-for-1 pizza in the pizza restaurant in the lobby of their building. 20 people redeemed the coupon, which was like literally they made it on an Apple laptop, like they load up Apple Mail, made PDF Maker, like emailed one at a time, all 20 people a coupon for 2-to-1 pizza. Now, I don't know about you. I certainly do not have the force. You guys probably would. If you had been there at the time, you would have been like, oh, 20 people got 2-for-1 pizza. Obviously, that's going to be the fastest business in history to get to $1 billion gross revenue. But I'm not that smart. I certainly wouldn't have been able to tell. And in fact, if you just start out, put up a blog for social coupons and you got 20 people, you'd be like, I don't think that's particularly significant. But because they'd had that failure before, because I'd spent a year trying to get anybody to do anything at all and failing, they understood how significant it was to sell 20 pizzas, and I gave them the confidence to keep investing. And that's the funny thing about the pivot. It is a learning moment which fundamentally restructures what business you're in without necessarily changing your overall vision, which, if you look at it, is still about collective action and empowerment of consumers. Does that make sense? And the premise of the lean startup is really simple. The way to think about runway for a startup is not how many months of burn you have left, although that's how we usually talk about it. It's really how many opportunities to pivot do we have left. And we can increase our runway by raising more money, getting more resources, or by cutting the right costs, or by learning to get this, by getting the same amount of learning per iteration, but faster. So if we can get to our pivot moments a little bit sooner, we've magically extended our runway without having to raise more money. That's why it's called the lean startup. Does that make sense? So learning is really the key concept, and this is something that most traditional managers get really hung up on, because in my experience, a manager who claims to have learned something is about to get fired. Let me explain why. I go to my CFO, maybe not at Microsoft, but I've heard at other companies, you have this problem. See if this sounds familiar, from your friends. You go to your CFO and you say, listen, I got this great idea for a hot new product, and all I need is $1 million in a year and a team of 25. And a year from now, we're going to have so many customers and so much revenue, it's going to be awesome. CFO's like, that seems like a high ROI. Put it in the spreadsheet. Much better ROI than this other thing we're planning to do. Here you go. And now fast forward a year later, and you're going to report progress. Now, what do we know for sure? We know for sure that the money got spent. The money always gets spent every time. So I spent the $1 million. I kept the 25 people busy, no problem. But we also know that it's very unlikely that we have any revenue at all. You go out to this year, you're like, listen, there's good news and the bad news. The bad news is, said I would have millions of dollars in revenue, actually none. But there's good news, I have learned so much. And if you just give us another year and another $1 million, it's totally going to work this time. And in a lot of companies, that will be the last report that general manager will ever give. Why? You think about it, if you fail to execute as a general manager, it can be for only one of two reasons. Either you didn't make a very good plan, in which case you should be fired, or even worse, you made a really good plan and you didn't execute it very well. That's really the only two possibilities, because in a world where planning and forecasting works, you should always be able to put together a good plan and execute it successfully. But in entrepreneurship, that leads to what I call achieving failure. Question is, if we're building something that nobody wants, why on earth would we be proud of having done it on time and on budget? Why is that such a good? But if you go to startup board meetings, if you go to the product prioritization meetings of entrepreneurial teams, what's being discussed? Are we on plan? Do we have the right features? Are we doing what we said to be done? It's rarely, did the person who put this plan together have any idea what they were talking about? Which the answer is almost always no. That's what it means to operate with extreme uncertainty. So I call it achieving failure because we successfully execute a bad plan. The image I always have in my mind is like I have these image of these general managers in a car, and the car is racing right off a cliff, and they're like, but we're getting great gas mileage. Mileage, it falls over. And the reason we do that is that in the 20th century, we learned how to execute plans with repeatability, even at massive scale. That is at the heart of all of our successful modern movements, including the lean revolution, which comes out of and we had this really brilliant strategic plan. See if this sounds good to you. Everybody knows that instant messaging is a network effects business, right? And so fundamentally, if everyone's already on an IM network, you can't bring a new network to market because you'd have to get everyone to switch. That requires bringing all their friends with them. Therefore, there's high switching costs. Therefore, there's a barrier to entry. Therefore, can't bring a new IM client to market. So the way you get around that strategic dilemma is you create an IM add-on that interoperates with all the existing clients and allows them to just do the 3D avatar chat, over the existing network. We actually went so far as to inject our own little UI button into all the other IM clients so that every client would just have this 3D button. You click it, boom. Here's the best part. When you click the button, we would automatically send an invite over the IM stream with a URL to the person you're chatting with. So our product was going to spread virally through all the IM networks. Doesn't that sound good? By the way, when I do this in MBA classrooms, this is the only part of the talk people are nodding along to. Like, I don't understand what this guy's talking about, but that is sound strategic planning. I totally get that. And there's just a tiniest little problem with that strategy, which is that every single thing I just said is wrong. But sounds really good, because sounds good are the two most dangerous words in entrepreneurship. Seems like it should be right, but it's wrong. And to make a long story short, our customers refused to behave in the way that we thought. They had never heard of an IM add-on, and they wouldn't use it. So we had spent 6 months building this product. I was the CTO of this company. I was cranking out the code for IM interoperability and all this other stuff. And after 6 months, everyone know the saying, time, quality, money, pick two? That sound familiar to anybody? Yeah. So we had to pick, you know what we had to pick. We had to cut some corners to get this product done in 6 months. And I will not mince any words about it. This product sucked when we shipped it. I mean, it would be just as likely to crash your computer. And we had to support all kinds of old, crappy operating systems like Windows 98. So we're talking about blue screen of death, more likely than 3D avatar delight. And I was a little bit nervous to ship that to customers. I was like, gosh, is my reputation going to be intact after this launch event? I mean, I had this image that some reporter would get our first version and they'd write this article. Idiots at IMVU don't know what quality software means. Never hire them again. But we were more afraid of building something that nobody wants, and so we said, all right, let's ship it. And so we released the product. We were really afraid. And at first I was actually relieved because nobody would use it. And so at least nobody found out how bad it was. And I was like, well, that's good. It didn't crash anybody's computer. And I was like, wait a minute. Is that actually a good thing? No, wait, why did I just spend the last 6 months of my life building something that nobody would download? I mean, they really wouldn't even try it. And to make a long story short, we had to pivot to a standalone IM client, and today IMView is very successful. But at the time, I was really depressed because I said, why did I have to be here putting in crazy hours the last 6 months if all my code had to be thrown away? And I was practicing all kinds of the latest agile development methodology, right? Lean manufacturing applied to software. Lean is supposed to drive waste out of your production process. And yet I had just contributed to the biggest waste of all, which is building something that people don't want. And so I was like, couldn't I have just been on a beach somewhere this whole time? I was like, okay, that's pretty sad. But I was like, no. You guys know the excuse I used, right? Because if we hadn't done that, if I hadn't written that software, we wouldn't have learned this important thing about customers, right? Remember I said learning is the oldest excuse in the book. And there's a reason why people who claim to have learned something get fired is you're usually making an excuse for having really screwed up. And that excuse made me feel better for a while, as it always does. But then I had this thought that was really disturbing. If my goal the last 6 months was to learn this important thing about customers, why did it take 6 months? How come the word learning is only coming up now as an excuse at the end? It's not like my co-founders and I were arguing every day about how we were going to learn things. You know what we argued about. What features did we absolutely have to have in V1 and which ones could we cut? Which bugs did we absolutely have to fix and which could we live with? The word learning didn't come up, not one time. But I was doing this thought experiment. I said, gosh, we supported like 12 different IM clients for interoperability. Would we have had the same learning value as if we'd supported only 6? Namely, that people don't want to use our product? Sure. Well, what if we'd supported only 3? What if we'd supported only 1? It's like, wait a minute, at one client, same learning value, but 1/10 the effort. That doesn't seem fair. But that wasn't depressing. What was really depressing was this. I said, wait a minute. What if we created just a single web page, like a 1-hour exercise, that has a screenshot of the product we proposed to build and a download button? Would we even have had to create page 2 where we apologize that the product doesn't exist yet? Or would a 404 have been sufficient? Think about it. What did I say before? I said they wouldn't try it. That means they literally wouldn't click the download button. So it doesn't even matter what was on page 2. 404 would have been just fine. And that was really disturbing because look, what did it say on my business card? It said Chief Technology Officer. It did not say Chief crappy landing page thing officer, right? So I was like, well, what does it mean if my work the last 6 months had the same value as this 1-hour exercise? Like that was just totally distressing to me in terms of my professional training, which was in the writing of software. But that's what I mean by validated learning. When we see everything that we do, every product feature we make, every marketing campaign, every action we take as a startup as an experiment designed to teach us whether we're on the path to a sustainable business, new and dramatic optimizations become possible. So instead of trying to wrangle, gosh, can we achieve the spec with slightly less effort by cutting corners? We can say, no, is there a different way to achieve the same learning at lower cost? And when we ask that question, wacky stuff happens. Like this concept of the build, measure, learn feedback loop. This is like the flux capacitor of the lean startup. This is the key. Here's a key idea right here on one slide. Everything we do in a startup should be geared towards optimizing total time through this feedback loop. It's a very simple loop. A software company is nothing more than a catalyst that turns ideas into code. Everything else, all the Mountain Dew and pizza, all that stuff, that's all side effect. When customers interact with that code, we collect data, we generate data, which we can choose to collect if we want through measurement. And then if we're really advanced, we can decide to learn from that data impacting our next set of ideas. This probably seems pretty straightforward, three-stage feedback loop. But it's very powerful because it lets us put the concept of the pivot on a more sound footing. A pivot is just one major turn to this feedback loop. That's it. And the nice thing about it is it allows us to start to answer some of these really difficult, thorny questions, which if you guys have ever been to, entrepreneur advice situations, I used to sit in tons of talks, talk to tons of entrepreneurs, and the advice would always go like this. If you're going to build something really new, make sure it's scalable from the beginning because you don't want to be like Friendster and have it like fall apart on you. That would be really embarrassing. But also don't worry too much about scalability because if you look at Facebook, first version didn't scale and it was fine. So it's like, got it. Make sure it's scalable and don't worry about scalability. Check. And it's like, make sure you use really good design because everyone knows that, Steve Jobs would never release a new product unless the design was really excellent. It's like, except for the fact that, Craigslist and eBay and all these other great companies had kind of crappy design and it really didn't matter. So make sure the design is really good and don't worry about it at the same time. And I used to have meetings like that, with my CEO president. He'd be like, we get this advice and he'd be like, go implement that advice. And I'm like, which part? He's like, all of it. No, seriously, it's self-contradictory. What am I supposed to do? And he's like, that's your job. You're the CTO. I was like, oh. Can't win. But really, seriously, how often should we release software to customers? The more often we release, the more overhead we incur. But the less often we release, the less opportunities for learning we have. So what's the best? In most organizations, I don't know if this is true in Microsoft, but most organizations I've been in, there's a kind of a war going on between the factions. And there's the defenders of quality who want to release at the slowest possible rate so we can take as much time as possible to test everything. And they would probably be happy to release once a decade if that was possible. But maybe they'd compromise down to once a year. And then you have the cowboy coder guys who just want to throw stuff on the wall and see what sticks. And they would basically release every 5 seconds if it was up to them. And the reason we've gotten to these polarized factions is that most managers have no freaking clue how often you should release. And they basically are like, well, I got people telling me one thing and another. Let's just kind of split the difference. If we take a little of this, a little of that, we'll get to a reasonable compromise. But you guys know what happens when we're splitting the difference. Everyone's like, oh, split the difference? Got it. So the more extreme my position, the more likely the outcome will be closer to what I want. Excellent. Let's release once a decade. Let's release once every 10 seconds. And then we wind up compromising at some ridiculous intermediate value. And we just keep pulling and pulling further apart. And I think managers have to take responsibility for creating those incentives. I think we can answer those questions in a much better way by simply saying, what frequency will optimize time through this loop? Because what we really want to know is how fast can we learn? And so when you look at it that way, releasing more frequently becomes a really powerful option, as long as we don't wind up trading quality for speed. Because if we're going too fast, we start to act sloppy, then all of a sudden we slow down our ability to go through this loop. And those of you who have studied lean manufacturing will notice this is exactly analogous to the kinds of problems that they had to work on in lean manufacturing. And if you read the book, you will see how the solutions that we've worked out in lean startup are exactly analogous. Things like the famous Anton cord and Toyota Factory have their direct analog in software development and something called continuous deployment. And I don't think we have time to go through continuous deployment in detail, so I'm actually going to skip over it. But it's pretty cool. If you haven't tried it, try it. You will like it, I promise. You can find these slides online. All of the specific techniques of lean startup, and this is all stuff you can find out more about on my blog, and obviously there's this great book coming out, each of these specific techniques has operates at one stage of this feedback loop, but it has, in my opinion, the net effect of optimizing total time. And if we start to implement them systematically, we start to build organizations that can start small, maybe with a tiny little 5-person team, maybe incubating inside a large company, but as they achieve product market fit, can scale without having to get slow and lethargic. That really is the holy grail of what we're trying to accomplish with this new entrepreneurial management. I promised you a really boring talk, and so I can't get to maximum boring. I have to talk about accounting, the most boring topic in history. But it's really important because at the end of the day, all of our modern management tools depend on accounting for their success because we have to be able to reward people for doing things better than planned. And we today think of accounting as like that thing we do to keep track of where the money went because we have forgotten how important it was to the development of the history of management. And I won't give you a history lesson in a second, but suffice to say that there was a time when people not only could make forecasts and they came true, they were so good at forecasting they could reward or demote managers based on how they did compared to forecasts. And I bet there are some divisions of Microsoft where that's even still true, where we know what the seasonal patterns are supposed to be, and therefore, just because you happen to, make some search engine improvement in the sports category the day before the Super Bowl, you can't be like, look, search traffic's way up. Obviously, it's because of my change. And yet in entrepreneurship, most of the time, we're still using those vanity metrics to make our decisions. Most teams I meet with, I ask them, hey, how do you know you're making progress? And they're like, well, we shipped this new feature last month, and this month the numbers are way up. And I'm like, interesting, I have an alternate theory. I heard that Mercury was in retrograde last month. And according to my astrological system, that makes numbers go up in general. And I said to the engineers, they get really offended. They're like, you're crazy. I'm like, well, which of us is crazy, actually? Because you're the one who works here. I'm just visiting. And yet both of us have no idea what's causing the numbers to go up. Why is that okay? And the problem with vanity metrics is not just that they're misleading, it's that it allows everyone to live in their own private reality. Because if the numbers go up, it's always because of what I was working on at the time. If I ask engineers about it, it'll be because of those great new features. But if I ask someone in marketing, it'll be because of the great new marketing campaign. If the PR person, it'll be because of that great hit we got on TechCrunch or whatever. And if I talk to someone in customer service, they'll probably tell me it was because of that great new customer service policy. And that wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for the psychological phenomenon that happens when the numbers go down. Because what happens when the numbers go down? All of a sudden, it's that other guy's fault. What I was working on was fine, but those idiots in marketing sabotaged it. Or my favorite is seasonal effects. For some reason, seasonal effects never cause numbers to go up, only down. Very strange. My work makes it go up. Seasonal effects makes it go down. So all the factions get to live in their own private reality where the stuff they do works, but the other idiots down the hall, that stuff doesn't work. And so can you imagine what it's like in such a team? I'm sure it's a strictly hypothetical question. Imagine what it's like in such a team trying to decide to pivot when we can't even agree on what the facts are. Like, is our fundamental strategy even working or not? It's a disaster. And the blame for that can't be placed on the individual people in the different silos. The blame has to be placed on senior management who is insisting on accounting for success using vanity metrics. And we need an alternate accounting system if we're going to be successful as entrepreneurs. I call it innovation accounting, not to be confused with innovative accounting, which can get you arrested, so be careful. Let's get rid of product development milestones. Let's just stop doing it and instead use learning milestones, of which there are 3 kinds. The first, establish the baseline. Who here has ever built a business plan? Anybody? Keep your hand up if the business plan had a spreadsheet in the back. Come on, be honest. Okay, keep your hand up if the spreadsheet in the back made predictions for revenue in year 3. Anybody? Keep your hand up if the prediction for revenue in year 3 came to pass. I got one person. Hey, that's the first time I've given like 5 talks in this week, and that's the first person to raise their hand. Congratulations, sir. Yeah, you should get some kind of prize, right? So that's the person who can use general management. The rest of you have to do something different. If I look at that spreadsheet, if I had the spreadsheet for your business plan with me, I guarantee you I would find some tiny little 3-point font box. And I look through the spreadsheet and it would say 10%. If I trace my finger along the spreadsheet and look to what it says percentage of customers who sign up for free trial or something like that. Now, is that the kind of thing that should be in 3-point font in Appendix C? Or should it be in giant red letters up on the wall of our office? Because that is a fundamental leap of faith assumption about your business. Here's how I know. What happens to your spreadsheet if I change that number to 0? Pretty exciting, right? All those numbers in year 5, 0, 0, 0, I can zero out your entire business by zeroing out one number. Well, is that something we should track pretty carefully? So what I want to do is get our attention away from the outputs of the spreadsheet, which in a high uncertainty situation are complete just garbage in, garbage out, and try to attack the garbage in part of the problem, which are all these assumptions baked into the spreadsheet. And so the point of the minimum viable product is to establish real information about those baseline numbers right now, even if it's bad news. Because look, it's way better to have bad news that's true than to have good news that we just made up. And so let's get the bad news over with. Find out if that number is supposed to be 10%, but right now it's 0%. Well, thank goodness we know, because now we can start to do milestone 2, which is to tune the engine. We see every action that we take as an experiment designed to drive those numbers from the horrible baseline towards the ideal that's in the model. And in my experience, there's only 2 ways this can go. Imagine you're on like a 1-month iteration cycle. You're trying to get to 10% conversion, right? You're currently at 0%. And over the sequence of iterations, sometimes it'll go like this. 3%, 5%, 7%, 8.5%. Okay, now that's 4 or 5 months time well spent. And you're not at 10% yet, but are you going to make it? Yeah, you're going to make it. You're fine, right? It's like the experiments you're doing are productive. They're causing customer behavior to change. Seems good. That's pattern A. Pattern B is something like this. You start at 0 and you do an iteration, and boom, you got it up to 5%. You're very excited. And then it goes like this: 5%, 5.5%, 5.75%, 5.8%, 5.81%, 5.815%. Now, that's like the definition of diminishing returns. And yet most teams that I meet with who are stuck in that situation are bragging to me about how the numbers are up and to the right, because they are still going up. And yet, are they going to make it to 10%? Come on. I mean, maybe that one more feature is going to do it, but come on. After a certain point, you get that feeling of the death march. You guys, I mean, other companies have this problem where they feel the death march setting in. And without the right analytics, without people getting out of those silos and having their own facts, we can't admit what's going on. It makes it impossible to change. So that's why we have this meeting we call pivot or persevere. Since we know we're going to fail in startups, let's not only have the pivot meeting like when it's bad news and it's during a death march and everyone's depressed. We know we're going to have to pivot, so let's just schedule the meeting in advance. Let's just say, look, 6 or 8 weeks from now, we're going to have a meeting. We're going to decide, hey, is it time to pivot or persevere? And then it's not necessarily bad news that we're having the meeting. It's a routine thing that we do all the time. And when you do that, then you can start to ask questions like this. Well, gosh, what kind of information would I want to have in the room at the time to decide whether I want to pivot or persevere? I can start to make predictions. Any of you studied science will start to sound a little bit familiar. I can say, well, gosh, if the numbers look like this 8 weeks from now, that's good news, and if it's not, it's bad news. If not, you run into the fallacy of Google Analytics, which is that no matter how bad you're screwing up at any time, you always can find at least one chart in Google Analytics that's up and to the right. So if you just kind of ship it and see what happens, you are guaranteed to succeed at seeing what happens. Because something will certainly happen, but the lesson of the scientific method is if you can't fail, you can't learn, and that's what we're trying to do. So that's innovation accounting in a nutshell. Obviously, in the book, you can learn a lot more about it. I think that it is impossible to have a successful entrepreneurial team. No, that's not impossible. It is impossible to innovate on a continuous basis if you don't use it in an accountability paradigm like this. You can have the lucky one-off wins inside the black box, but it's not a sustainable model. And that's why we are wasting people's time and we have to stop. And that's why you all are going to read this book. Gosh, I haven't even updated it to say coming in the past. So we've got to work on that. But I see that there's books in the back, so I'll be happy to sign as many as I can. And I just wanted to say it's really fun to be back, and thank you all very much. Please get in touch if you have thoughts, questions, comments. I really want to hear. So thank you all very much. Is there time for a few questions? Sure. Excellent. I'll take some questions. Unless I stump the whole room. That's exciting. I'm patient. Yeah.
So a lot of what I read in TechCrunch, it talks about how engineers are in short supply. And I'm a marketer. I have an MBA. And I've been trying to think of